to be able to go ahead and track as well. So just a few housekeeping components. This is going to be a repeat series. We're repeating the series through the month of December, just to kind of give everybody some time to get access to content, and then also to hear from each of you maybe what other topics of interest might be and how we can provide support. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started so we can acknowledge and honor everyone's time. But again, if anything comes up, feel free to throw something in the chat box or unmute yourself and distract me, because I'm sure that I'm going to miss something at some point in time. So today we are specifically talking about working with an interpreter. And I kind of created this in the idea of, you know, we might have some here that are doing mental health support, some who are maybe just working as volunteers. So it's a little bit broad, but it's also this idea of kind of like what the interpreter should be presenting as in terms of their role. And then from there also what it looks like kind of before working with an interpreter, during the time that you are, and then maybe perhaps afterwards. So here's the thing, this isn't necessarily going to cover specifics for every single situation. It's somewhat of a general, right? But hopefully something that can give us at least a bit more of an understanding of where things are at and what's going on. So with that being said, again, for any of you who are just joining us, I know I've been admitting people as I've been speaking. This QR code will take you to a sign-in. We're going to try to start offering this at the beginning of every session, just to track who is joining us and from where. I know I've been getting a lot of emails from a lot of different organizations, which is really exciting. So this is the session for working with an interpreter, and we will go ahead and get started. So best practices to consider, obviously, when working with an interpreter is we want to work with trained interpreters as much as possible to make sure that we're using effective communication between the individual or client and the provider, whoever that might be, whether it's a therapist or you know, a doctor or practitioner. So we want to be using those trained interpreters as much as possible to help with effective communication and then to improve outcomes, right? Oftentimes we, in hopes of helping with communication, might pull in a friend or an individual who maybe comes with the member, and while that can happen, it you know, for matters of confidentiality and things like that, we want to attempt to avoid that. So who serves as an interpreter? Well, we're hoping it is someone who is trained bilingual or multilingual staff member or an on-staff interpreter, contract interpreters, telephone interpreters, or trained volunteers who are working with an organization or a cause. And then who do we hope to not utilize and have serve as interpreters? And this can be family, friends, children under the age of 18, or untrained volunteers. So the role of an interpreter is one where this individual, similar to other professions, right? They have a code of ethics that they follow, and you know, 2 points of their ethics here are to convey everything that is being spoken and to do so in a non-judgmental attitude. So they have a code of ethics that they work to follow. And one of the other aspects that an interpreter will help facilitate, along with the individual who's maybe the professional who's bringing the interpreter in, is to consider seating arrangements to promote eye contact, right? So what we hope to do in whatever circumstance is have the communication be as natural as possible between the individual client and the provider. Therefore, having the interpreter, sit side by side with the client can sometimes cause for the client to be turning and looking at the interpreter. So creating an environment seating wise where perhaps the provider and the interpreter are side by side so that eye contact, if it's comfortable, is able to be maintained as much as possible. And yeah, to avoid the client having to, turn back and forth. We also want to make sure that when we're working with an interpreter, right, their role is to use first person in interpretation between what is being spoken. So, and that's in both directions. The therapist and the client are speaking to each other, not about each other, or the individual and the provider, right? They're speaking to each other. So using first person interpretation. Also, the role of an interpreter is not to really edit, add, substitute, omit, polish, or even interject their own personal values with what is being spoken or brought up during a session. Additionally, an interpreter helps control the pacing of the interview. So they might ask the provider to, slow down, or they might help facilitate asking for repetition as needed between either themselves and the provider or for the individual client. The role of the interpreter is also one where they communicate if they are not sure how to interpret what is being said. So the provider is aware of this might not be a direct interpretation, a picture might have to be somewhat painted here to communicate information. And of course, they translate all statements being spoken. So this is basically how we are hoping they come into the room. And this is, again, why we really emphasize seeking out a trained interpreter or someone with experience rather than just utilizing family or friends or even children. With that, there's not as much validity that we can ensure those things are happening. So in terms of working with an interpreter before an actual meeting, right, if you have the benefit of being involved in this process, it's always helpful to identify which language is appropriate for the individual client that you will be working with. There may be several languages or dialects that are spoken in the client's country of origin. So really not just going based off of country of origin, but making sure you have the correct language or dialect that needs to be spoken. It's also helpful, depending on the work you're doing and the content that will be covered, to consider gender and ethnicity. And this is important to hold in mind when selecting an interpreter. Certain interpreters may not necessarily be appropriate for the type of work you're anticipating doing with particular clients and the situation that they're in. So if circumstances or accommodations can be allowed, it's really helpful to ask the individual client if they have a preference, or even to consider that for yourself as you're arranging interpretive services. Additionally, if you have the opportunity, meeting with the interpreter before the client arrives, if you have the privilege of working consistently with an interpreter, that creates a strong sense of understanding. But if it is the first time, it's really helpful to perhaps meet with them before the individual client arrives and discuss with them what type of meeting you're having, if you plan on having the desire for the interpretation services to not be simultaneous, but consecutive interpretation. And we'll talk more a little bit about that later. But then also with them to discuss the seating arrangement and to arrange accordingly so that that's ready to go prior to the individual client arriving. Some other things that are worth considering are during the time that you are working with an interpreter, holding in mind, right, that information is being repeated and at times requires clarification. Some concepts and systems just simply don't exist in other countries or cultures or languages. So providing some extra time to allow for interpretation and clarification, and just knowing that it might not be a speedy process. So for example, I facilitated a workshop this summer and had the individual, coming for an hour, but the workshop content was really only 30 minutes so that we could have that extra time and space for interpretation and clarification. And quite honestly, it did end up taking the full hour, but it's better to kind of hold that in mind prior rather than, trying to rush through or extend time. Another aspect is introducing yourself to both the individual client and the interpreter. And during this time, it's really helpful to explain, some interpreters come and have specific information they share at the beginning and explain their main task, obviously. But this is also something that you can engage in, which is just explaining that the interpreter's main task is to enable communication and that they are doing so with confidentiality. And this is an area that I think brings a lot of concerns for certain clients. And I know it's one that's been expressed multiple times to myself, of just this fear of, how do I know this person isn't going to go back to the community and speak about what I have shared or spoken out loud here? So stating that at the beginning can be really helpful. They're here to help with communication and do so with confidentiality. And this can be a new concept for a lot of individuals. So maybe even explaining specifically what confidentiality is, if that's needed. Of course, speaking more slowly rather than loudly, right? We have these tendencies of knowing when there is a communication barrier, perhaps, that if we just raise our voice and talk a little louder, it'll make understanding easier, when really the reality is the bulk of our individual clients that we're working with are most likely not hard of hearing. They're just speaking another language. And then, of course, speaking at an even pace in relatively short segments, pausing so the interpreter can interpret. And this allows just for much more effective communication between the interpreter and the individual client. So I typically let people know when they are working with an interpreter for the first time, we have these natural pauses in our speech where we might stop to take a breath, and utilizing those nuances as an invitation to just pause and give time for interpretation. And some interpreters will say, you can speak a little longer or shorter, but it's helpful for you to consider how you can speak at a consistent pace in short segments to allow for clear interpretation. Another aspect to consider when working with an interpreter is to be aware of the concepts that you're expressing and the language you're choosing to use. Again, not everything translates from English to another language. And so if we are using concepts that might be unfamiliar, the interpreter will have to go through the process of maybe painting a word picture to to help explain some of the terms. So some simple suggestions of things to avoid are just, idiomatic speech or really complicated sentence structure or sentence fragments. I myself even have a tendency to start a thought and then mid-sentence maybe change my track of thinking or change my idea. So things like that, asking, multiple questions in succession, one after the other, those are things that can make the interpretation a little bit more challenging. And of course, we want to remain aware of nonverbal communication by all members in the room. So not just of the individual client, but of ourselves, of the interpreter, right? So body language and facial expressions are really key in communication. And we know that if our body language or a facial expression is contradicting this tone that's being communicated or the information that's being conveyed, it can create confusion among multiple people in the room. And so, of course, allowing time for clarification. One way to do this, specifically if you are, communicating information that feels really important, is asking the individual client to consider how they could explain it back to you or repeat back to you what is being said, to just make sure that there is some understanding, or to see if they need anything further clarified, or to even consider how to further explain or answer some questions for them. So this is also a time where it's really, throughout the entire process, it's really vital to not have these private conversations with the interpreter in the process of the session, right? We don't want the client feeling excluded. And that again goes back to maintaining eye contact. Yes, the interpreter is there to help facilitate communication, but we really want to be attuned to the individual in the room. And so again, if there is any questions or clarifications, speaking that even out loud and explaining to the client, but not asking for them to maybe engage in for the interpreter to engage in a conversation with you that excludes the client. And then of course, patience, right? Abundance of patience is helpful in all aspects of work that we do, because providing care across a language barrier takes time. It takes time even without a language barrier, right? But it takes even a little more time when we have a language barrier. So being patient, really knowing that with time, building rapport and clear communication aids in trust and relationship. Everyone wants and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. So patience with the individual client allows for them to communicate more openly and honestly with you, throughout the process of services. So we've just covered, what to do before and what to do during, and then there's some information that can be helpful regarding what to do after. And again, this can vary from situation to situation, but after the work is done with the interpreter, you may want to just ask for feedback, like, was the pacing okay? Especially if you will be utilizing interpreters again, right? What you don't know until you know, and so feedback is always an opportunity to grow. But asking for feedback about interpretation, and then considering if this is at all a possibility, Well, let me pause here and just say, asking for feedback, again, I want to clarify, this is not you asking for feedback on like, how do you think the session went? Do you think they understood? What is your opinion of the client? That's not what we're doing in that moment. We're specifically asking for feedback about, you know, our pacing, the language we were using, things like that. So again, if this is at all possible and you anticipate doing this work for an extended period of time with an individual and you feel like it went well, consider using the same interpreter for following sessions, if at all possible. This just, again, aids in building trust with the client. It aids in building clearer communication, provides some consistency, right? They know what to expect. It can be really challenging for an individual to not always know who they're going to end up with as an interpreter. And so this goes back to, again, why we do see friends and family and children being utilized for interpretive services. It's because there is relationship there or a sense of familiarity. But then again, you know, it's how accurately can that be communicating the information. Oh no, the slide is frozen. Oh, it's better now? Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you for letting me know. This is life, right? We plan for the best and hope not the worst. So, okay. So another aspect of perhaps working with an interpreter after a session is, you know, I just had this conversation this morning with an individual, is, you know, oftentimes the individuals doing this work have the knowledge and ability to speak this language, but that's often connected to aspects of their personal life being very similar or reflective to what may be discussed, right? So to give some context here, if we are working with individual clients who are refugee status, we might be working with an interpreter who was a former refugee. And even though they have been in the States for a period of time, right, they have some similar experiences. So as we know, I'm assuming most of us know, right, when we hear certain information, it can impact us in a way that maybe brings up emotions or, you know, recalls a previous experience we've had, or it's just heavy and challenging. So this is something that can also happen with interpreters that we are asking to support clients, especially if we're doing therapeutic work with an interpreter. So, you know, the hope is that utilizing interpreters for therapeutic work, that we have been able to support them in having some background knowledge or understanding of what it looks like to move into that therapeutic setting, but then also perhaps just, you know, checking in with them and seeing if they need any information or resources to be able to care for themselves as they continue doing this really important work that can also be really emotional and challenging and just produce really strong reactions to everyone. So again, just holding in mind that some of them may have survived similar experiences, and that could be, you know, re-traumatization or a countertransference from their interpreting work. And they might not have formal structures or awareness of like what it looks like to engage in care and repair practices that help them. And then finally, of course, if there's any necessary paperwork, and and again, this is a very broad statement because it's going to perhaps look differently for every organization or agency or individual. But sometimes there can be paperwork, depending on where you are at, that's needed to be completed. One, to provide payment to the interpreter and document that those services were utilized. So just checking in and seeing what there needs to be done. So we've covered what happens before, we've covered what happens during, and some of what can happen afterwards. And what I'd like to do now is actually, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and then just allow for questions, or if anyone has had an experience that they would like to speak about. But before I stop sharing my screen, I just want to quickly provide this reminder that we're planning on meeting again next week, same time, same virtual space. And the topic for next week will be mental health with new Americans. So let me stop sharing here. And for those of you, I'm going to do this one more time also. For those of you who joined us a little late, which is totally fine, there is a link to a Google form that I'm going to throw in the box. And if you don't mind just clicking on that and utilizing that as a way to kind of sign in, so we can start just collecting information about who's here and from what location. So yeah, I'll just preface by saying, like, I might not have all the answers, but I'm willing to hear questions and, do what I can to help find any answers. Or if there are any of you who have specific experiences you want to speak about, or any other helpful information you would like to offer to the group, feel free to throw it in the chat or to unmute yourself if there's any of that.
So when it comes to kind of debriefing with the interpreter afterwards, you said that there could be some re-traumatization going on. How do you handle that as a therapist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to preface by saying I'm not a therapist yet. I feel like that's really important. Don't want to be misleading anyone. But in groups that I have facilitated as a supportive individual, I think I always make space, and I also have background in education. So I did a lot of work with interpreters in educational settings through IEP meetings. And I always would just take time, like after the conversation is done, and just, I'm paying attention to kind of their body language, asking how they're doing, seeing what comes up. And then from there, just noticing, or I might even name, like, what's coming to mind for me right now is a meeting that I was in with a particular child, and it was a really, really difficult situation. And so just saying to the interpreter, like, that was really heavy. Are you doing okay? And just asking and giving some space for them. Right. For some of them, that's the first time they've maybe met me too. So I'm holding that in mind as well, as like, I might not be the one that they divulge all of that to. And there's obviously boundaries, right? Of like, the more I'm in relationship with a person, then the better able I am to maybe offer some support or ask some more specific questions. So anyone else, since, caveat, not a therapist yet?
I'll add just a little piece to that, if that's okay. I think I would also, if it does appear that they do have some distress, check in to make sure that they have support for that. It could be through their own mental health provider, but it also could be if they have family or friends that they are able to process stuff with, not, and making sure they understand you don't share what was talked about in the session, but they can, of course, talk about how it impacted them and share with people if things have been triggered for themselves. So they might, you know, kind of debrief with a family or friends saying, hey, yeah, this really made me think about this thing that happened to me. And I might just check with them and see if they feel like they need some additional mental health support. Do you want a referral or a connection with your own therapist, someone who is not the person leading that specific session, but maybe another therapist in the agency or another person who can work with that kind of trauma?
Thank you. Thank you to both of you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for asking it.
I've got maybe a sort of a follow-up thing. So I wasn't here last week, but I was really interested in the interpretation piece. My wife works with a lot of folks in the Latino community, and so I've been around some of the translation issues and interpreting issues. Everybody in my family is bilingual with Spanish except me, so I value interpretation and being around that. So thank you for the overview. The aspect that we're talking about right now, with the possibility that we would not just have, I'm kind of anticipating with Afghan refugees that likely we're not going to just have somebody, maybe who was just bilingual, who's an Anglo, who's bilingual, but likely have somebody who comes from that community, and the sensitivity that you're talking about, you know, their own trauma and all of that. But I'm also kind of wondering about, they have cultural insights that I know that, you know, we're in a position where we're holding the issues that are coming at us. But is there room for checking in with an interpreter about, you know, hey, I'm culturally naive about this or that, and as I'm saying that, I can imagine that maybe that could be something, if I'm in touch with during the session, that I could even bring it up, right? I could bring up a question that I have, and then maybe it could be discussed right there. But I'm also just kind of wondering that a possibility of an interpreter going, well, maybe this is what's going on. So anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So what I hear you asking is it appropriate to seek clarification or utilize the interpreter to gain further cultural understanding for the individual? Does that sound correct? Okay.
Yeah, and as I'm asking it to keep things clear and in the open, then I'm thinking, well, that if that comes up for me, or came up in a session and didn't get talked about, then the next time I could just put it out there, and then we could all talk about it. That, to me, that might be the way to go.
Yeah. I think I'd love to hear what anyone else has to say here. I think my response is going to be rooted in, I don't think it's ever wrong or bad to gain further cultural understanding. And so, you know, doing some of that prior is always beneficial. But again, there's so much to learn and to understand, and some of that's just going to take time. So I think if we were to consider where in the process we could utilize something like that, maybe even saying before the session starts, you know, I recognize that I, as a practitioner or a facilitator, do not have all of the cultural nuances and understandings. So if at any point in time I do something, I would like you to be very forthright and explain to me that's not appropriate, or this is perhaps not appropriate for the culture going on right now. And so giving that permission, I think, from the beginning to the interpreter, But then maybe even at the beginning with the client too, right? Because we can say, oh, we're going to do a session on Afghan culture, but the reality is like we're all, I don't know, because it's a bunch of black boxes with names. We are, we could claim, oh, we're all in West Michigan, right? So we should say pop and I don't know, we could throw out these very general terms, but within each of us, there are individual nuances. And so I think maybe even giving permission for the individual too, right? And we don't want to place the burden on them to educate us on their culture, but to give permission that says, I value your culture. I know it's an important part of your identity. So if it's appropriate for you to share with me, so I can better understand and support you. I think that's how I would offer a response to that question, but I'd love to allow space for anyone else.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I think two things that I would do would be, if it's during the session, you might just ask the client that question and have the interpreter go through their process of interpreting, so that you can, just like you would with any other curiosity, trying to understand the client situation, say, help me understand this a little better. I think this might be really important for me to understand how this works in your culture. And having the client themselves explain that piece. And then if you do have that time with the interpreter afterwards, maybe using that time to ask a little bit more in depth if there's something that might need further clarification, because you don't want to take up like a 15-minute chunk of your session having the interpreter explain a piece of the culture. You want the focus to stay on that client.
Mm-hmm.
But afterwards, if there is a little bit of time, that might be a good time to use their cultural knowledge and get that a little bit deeper understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Yes.
So I have worked, so I guess I wanted to clarify and ask real quick too. So is everyone here therapists or functioning as therapists or almost therapists or therapy adjacent, or it wasn't clear on the invitation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I will say this. It started out as a way to support those who are going to be in process or coming back out of retirement to do this work with therapeutic mindset. However, in the past week, we've had so many reach out and just say, like, I think this could be applied to some of the work that I'm doing. So yes and no.
Okay.
My
So I've worked for about a decade in nonprofit therapy work, first at a community mental health and now with Pine Rest. Never have I had the opportunity or the communication to me. I apologize, my dogs are shaking and their collars are moving in the background. Sorry about that. So never has anyone asked me or offered me the opportunity to request a translator, to meet with them before or after. And this is working with folks that are pretty much almost always, if not uninsured or Medicaid, occasionally private insurance, but typically uninsured or Medicaid for obvious reasons. And so I think some of those suggestions make a lot of sense if there's the practical means to do it. If you can meet beforehand, awesome. If you can, I like this person, can I meet with them? Again, or this, this person got along really, or the client met really well and seemed like they were comfortable. Great. If you can request, but never has it been an option expressed to us that that's something that we could request the same one of, or that we could do as far as our day is built out, there is not any kind of pre-time or post-time to check in first or to afterwards. And honestly, I mean, it might sound, I don't know, not great, but my client, and of course I want to treat the interpreter as a human being with all dignity and respect and everything, but my client is my client, and that's the person who I'm primarily kind of trying to focus on. And if I get into a processing session afterwards of how the interpreter's doing, not only do I not have the time or space to get into all of what might be going on, but that just seems like can of worms. But obviously, of course, I still want to be respectful, of course, of them. And are we, while still trying to give them all the basic dignity and respect as we would any other person, to some extent trying to kind of essentially pretend they're not there? Like, is that kind of what, right? Because we're wanting to be talking with the client directly, you know, speaking with them. I've had this with deaf clients as well. So not just other verbal languages.
Right.
And obviously it gets even trickier when we're doing it through telehealth. I've had a few of those since COVID started, but not a bunch. So I guess I kind of wanted to clarify a little bit, but for me as a therapist, the biggest challenge or my biggest reluctance towards doing, you know, doing therapy with folks that require an interpreter is therapy for me is so much about the flow of the conversation and how you're able to read responses, reactions, how you're able to build that relationship with the client. So for me, one of my big challenges, one of my interests in this, and probably pursuing more potentially education and training, is working with that and adapting my own comfort and my own skill level in the responses that I'm getting, which are delayed and are translated through the language and are through concepts that may not be familiar to that person, and trying to adapt it in a way that still works. So I realized that was long-winded, so I'm sorry about that. I brought up several things, but that's, I guess, my perspective right now. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. So I hear you speaking a few things, and I think, right, like we want to treat all humans with dignity and respect. When I spoke that phrase earlier in the presentation, it's specifically in that regard, it was specifically holding the client in mind of like, you know, I'm not raising my voice to talk louder to try to communicate, and I'm not turning and interacting with the interpreter. So yes, we want all humans to be treated that way, but ideally, right, in that moment, we are focused on how we're communicating with the client. And I hear your concerns with like, if I check in, that opens a can of worms. And yeah, that's not necessarily another client that we're taking on, right? So I think it's I see the concern there and what that could bring about. And I think you're also naming an unfortunate reality, which is that unless we are a part of an organization that has specifically hired interpreters to work with their clientele, we are not typically going to get repeat interpreters. A position that I had, I was literally calling on the phone as I'm walking up to the door, and it's just like whatever person picked up their phone from the agency is who did the interpretation. And it was really hard to, guarantee I'm getting a female instead of a male. And then you would call back and the same male person would answer. So I think, just acknowledging like, yeah, there are some parts of this system that make it a little bit challenging if we're not in an organization that has a set group of people that we can utilize. And that makes the work a little bit maybe more challenging to navigate. So,
and that seems like that would get even trickier too with male female stuff, especially if you're trying to do a therapy session and like the only person's available is a male and it's a female client, or vice versa, or whatever, that can be quite tricky. Just logistically.
Yeah. And I think, again, just naming like, gosh, there's a lot of complexity to a lot of things in life. And this, though we value bilingual, multilingual individuals, like it is an aspect that can sometimes create a challenge in making sure that we are able to move through something with the same level of sensitivity and care that we often have the privilege of doing with an individual who speaks the same language as us. So, yeah, I guess, does anyone else want to speak to that? Like, does anyone have experience of having the privilege and benefit of working with like an in-house interpreter or, a repeat interpreter? Or is general census just like, okay.
I know if you have, it does depend on what your system is. So if you're using the phone call system through a service, you might just get this, whoever you get. But if you have a consistent weekly time and you're using therapy services through Liaison Linguistics or Bethany Christian Services, then you can request to have that same person, and you can be a little more specific in trying to screen out some potential issues with the male female. With I know there's sometimes issues with someone might speak multiple languages from a country, but that might also mean they might be from maybe one of the oppressor groups. So you might want to see if you can screen out some of those issues, if you can, and you don't always have that ability. But if you're working with a local agency and an in-person individual, you can ask some of those questions or request some of that information to Bethany or whoever you're using to try to minimize that process. And then typically, especially if you do have that consistent time, you can see if you can set up that that's the same person you're meeting with every time. And that in the past has worked well for me. Yeah. And I will say, I know it's harder and the flow is very different. So I wouldn't go into a session expecting it to feel just like any other therapy session. It's going to be different. It just is. But I kind of weigh that with, well, yeah, it's going to be different and harder, but the alternative is they don't get any assistance at all. So I would rather give them some opportunity to process, knowing it's going to be harder, knowing it will probably be slower, but at least they're getting some support in an area that they probably have not ever gotten support in before. See, one other thing, you probably said this, eye contact with the client, not the interpreter.
Yes.
So while you're having that discussion, you're talking to the client, but also make sure you're looking at the client. So I sometimes very rarely even look at the translator.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I think, you know, we just have these innate things in us where like we want to turn to the person that's talking, and we have a tendency to do that. But again, when we are utilizing an interpreter, right, they're acting as a voice for the individual who we are doing the work with. And I think that's just a practice that, you know, takes practice to keep eye contact on the actual person that we're providing the service to not use third person language. Can you ask her if she da 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 da, right? That happens a lot in the initial stages of working with an interpreter whenever I'm facilitating and someone's kind of coming at it for the first time. And so again, that's part of our hope in, you know, offering a session like this is we're not expecting you to do it perfectly, but just again, offering some information and reminders of how to move through that. So yeah, so many great questions and things to come up, and I just want to read what's in the chat here. Is someone mentioned the psychological first aid training that they recently did and how they talked about listening and linking. So if you are talking to the interpreter at the end and maybe noticing, like just saying to them, you know, that you're not their clinician, right? That's the boundary. You're willing to be an empathetic listener, but then linking them to a resource. And Jessica spoke to that. And I would say, yes, it's not your responsibility to like take on their therapeutic work. But it can be a point for you to provide access to resource and to point them in a direction that could be a resource for them. So let's see, I'm looking at time and just want to check in and see, are there further thoughts, questions, maybe what's resonating with you that you're going to keep chewing on figuratively after this time's over?
Are there books or like audiobooks or podcasts or other resources that any of you all would recommend that would be useful for us to help with that, or trainings or whatever? I would appreciate that if you know of any. Otherwise, I've kind of done some of my own looking a little bit online, but just curious.
Yeah, such a great question. You know, I will tell you that off the top of my head, I do not know of any books or resources. I feel like what's kind of out there on the web is just very, it's going to be very similar to what was spoken here. I would say most of what I have come to learn is by, unfortunately, like being in the middle of it and making mistakes and learning and like recognizing what needs to go differently. But I'm assuming you filled out the sign-in sheet and recorded your email. So I'm gonna just see what I can come across. And if I do come across anything, I will gladly send it on to you. Yeah, great question. Really great question.
I've got a question about, it's a logistical piece
Sure.
regarding, doing online, doing virtual. That's a lot of the work I'm doing. And so it's a really two-pronged thing. I've always done groups with men. I work in a men's center. I work with Jessica at Fountain Hill Center, and a part of our program is we have a men's program. So I've never had an interpreter in a group because I've always sort of anticipated that would be too cumbersome, and maybe we could still pull that off. But a lot of our group, well, all of our groups now are being done remotely. And also I anticipate with refugee community, there could be trauma work, and I do EMDR, and I've actually been doing EMDR remotely. So my thought about somebody coming into a group could be that it could be a whole lot easier remotely, logistically, because you could mute, do the translation, come back in. How does this work if a client is going to be seen remotely and an interpreter connecting? How does that logistically work?
That's a really great question.
Or does it?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think we've all had a steep learning curve these past 18 months, thanks to the pandemic. But so I will say, I don't know as much about virtual interpretation. I know that when I've utilized phone interpretation in the past, it's often like just calling a particular number that takes me to a particular platform that matches me with, you go through this process of saying, this is the language I need. And then they, call in an interpreter for that. So here's my non-answer to your question is that I think it's very dependent on the platform you're utilizing. If, for example, you are using Zoom and working with an interpreter, right? It's perhaps as simple as they're getting the link, the same invite link that the clients are getting. They're part of the group, you explain their role, and then they go back and forth through interpretive services. A lot of healthcare services have shifted now and have specific portals to do virtual appointments through. And so it might be very specific to the platform that's being utilized in that regard. So probably doesn't help you at all in that regard, because I without knowing the specific platform.
Well, I think it does. I think it does. Just what you're saying, I could see how that could work. I mean, as long as the client had access to a Zoom meeting, and then the interpreter could have access. Obviously we all know that something gets lost by not being in the same room together, right?
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
But in terms of a group situation, I could really see how, then confidential, we'll figure out, I'll talk more with Jessica about all the logistics about that. But thank you.
Yeah.
But I might consider, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, again, with telehealth, like even within therapeutic services, right, there's this big conversation that, some people are saying Zoom isn't confidential, so you need to be using specific platforms. And I think that is going to vary from state to state. And so yeah, so I think, again, I don't really have a specific answer for you, but I think just like you would have to state at the beginning of any group therapeutic practice, like confidentiality is what we want, but also recognize like we can't control every single person in the circle. And so we're entrusting that confidentiality will be maintained from, client to client, but it should be guaranteed from interpreter to clients and vice versa. And I'll just quickly say this in terms of, ranking most ideal to least ideal in working with an interpreter. I would say most ideal is obviously in person, to least ideal is over the phone, just because the interpreter can't read body language. They're not picking up on the cues. I've just had horrendous experiences using a phone interpreter. And so most ideal would always be in person. I say the in-between would be a virtual, and at all costs avoiding phone interpretation if you can. So yeah, Jessica.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think for your EMDR sessions, you'll be fine. It's the same as anything else, right? For your group sessions, what I have not done at all, this is just a thought, not something I've ever done, but I might consider having both of them log into the Zoom session. So they're both on the screen, they're both interactive, but maybe having the interpreter connected by phone to the client that needs the interpretation, so that there's not the two voices talking the whole time, so that they can interpret to the client while everything is going on in the group. And then when the client wants to interact, they can unmute and do that with the rest of the group. I'm just thinking of the simultaneous, like you're trying to talk, the interpreter is trying to talk, and the rest of the group is getting a little lost in the layers.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that goes back to those keywords that were offered in the presentation of like simultaneous interpretation versus consecutive interpretation. So simultaneous is like you're speaking and the interpreter is interpreting simultaneously. And quite honestly, for me personally, I cannot handle interpretation like that. I just noticed like I start having a difficult time paying attention, keeping my focus. So what I prefer is consecutive interpretation. And this is also one that demonstrates more effective communication. And that is communicating a few sentences, pausing, letting the interpreter do their work, and then coming back. Does it slow the process down? Absolutely. Oh no. Sorry, I just got a little notice that I got signed out. Hopefully we're all okay. It is 1 o'clock, so if you have to go, feel free to go. But I'll just quickly say this, like if you can do that consecutive, it can be more time intensive, but it does aid in clearer communication. So, okay. I don't know why I suddenly got working with a nonprofit. This is what happens. So it's 1 o'clock. I just want to say for all of you that are here, thank you for being here, sharing your lunch hour with us. Always continue to offer feedback or questions. If you have anything, feel free to email me. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see you next week for the session on supporting mental health with new Americans. And just a little caveat, we're saying new Americans because we are recognizing, one, often refugees don't want to have the refugee label for the rest of their life. We want to acknowledge their shift at times, but also we want to acknowledge that there are many individuals in our community beyond refugee status that are in a very similar circumstance and situation. So we want to encompass them in our work as well. So
are you going to send something out about giving the dates and times for when you are going to repeat these over? Because I literally just found out about these like last week after all my schedule and stuff was booked. So I think if we knew that you were going to I just happened to be able to squeeze in today because I had a cancellation. So
yeah,
are you guys able to put out there or send out either through the email, through the sign in or whatever, if you could let us know when these loop back around, I could plan ahead and that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so I'll definitely send you the email, but basically every Wednesday, noon to 1, this is the second Wednesday of the month. So the interpreter session is going to be the second Wednesday of November, the second Wednesday of December.
Got it.
The mental health is always going to be the third Wednesday. And then after that, we're going to kind of reevaluate and see if there are new topics we need to add in, or if we can, if we need to keep repeating. We are hoping to have an individual be able to speak specifically to culture, the Afghan culture, the fourth Wednesday. And we're starting there just because of the number of new arrivals that will be coming. So far, we haven't found anyone, so fingers crossed we do. But our hope is then that we can expand and start recognizing, like in Grand Rapids, we have 8, within my organization, we have 8 different community groups that we're working with. So we kind of want to highlight each of their cultures and give an opportunity to build awareness for all of them. So, but I will still send you the flyer. And yes, I know it's been very slow getting out, but we'll figure it out as we go. So
Thank you, I appreciate it.
yeah, thank you all for your time. I appreciate you being here. I hope the rest of your day goes well and you get to enjoy these bright blue skies while we still have them. So have a lovely afternoon.